Good day. Welcome to this edition of the YAHOWAH blog. It is a Sunday morning, the 29th of December, 2024. I'd like to return to one of the most important subjects of our day. That is of progressives claiming, falsely of course, that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. First, I'd like just to address the concept of progressive. Like everything that this new version of liberal politics would have one believe, the term is misapplied. There is nothing progressive about them. They are trying to turn back the clock on everything. It's like erasing history, erasing reality. And there is nothing positive or progress related to what would occur if they were empowered, because they would turn economics more socialistic and therefore less productive. Nonetheless, these hypocrites, these today's, I would say, complete and total ignoramuses. I know that's not a very polite term, but their behavior is disgusting. In fact, it is largely because of the progressive attitude towards everyone who does not concur with their mantra, their religious zeal, that Donald Trump was recently elected. That middle ground that determines who becomes president of the United States voted overwhelmingly, not so much for Donald Trump, but against the progressives, because their voice was so shrill and so demeaning. Well, on one topic, I am particularly frustrated by them, annoyed by them. And that is this notion that Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza when the opposite is true. The fact is, if you want to know about modern genocides, the most recent iteration of genocide is when Israel was given back its statehood. And when that occurred, the 50 Islamic nations around Israel began genocide against Jews. The population of Jewish people, of Jewish residents, Jewish citizens in the Islamic countries declined by over 99% in 75 years. That is genocide. By contrast, the population of Muslims within Israel has grown 4 to 5 times what it was in 1948. The problem with all of this is that it's, again, fun with words. Genocide has simply been redefined. And I'll speak to you in a moment about what the term originally meant, and we'll talk about how it is being redefined so that it can be applied by these progressives and such, well, ignorant, immoral, and inappropriate ways. The story is one I have alluded to previously, that a group of Northern California residents, of course, all progressives, it is the bluest of blue states, filed a class action suit against their congressional representatives. Of course, those congressional representatives were Democrats because the state is largely Democratic. They were Democrats Mike Thompson and Jared Huffman. It accused them of causing great harm to the local communities. Well, of course, they caused no harm to the local communities, but again, in progressive mantra, where platitudes matter and positions of faith are all that account, that matter to them at all, facts are irrelevant. They said they're also causing great harm to Palestinians in Gaza. Well, the fact is, there are no Palestinians. If you can't make your case by telling the truth, you don't have a case. There hasn't been a Palestinian for 2,300 years. And even then, the correct term was Philistine. The Philistines are only known to us through the Torah and prophets. So if the Torah and prophets' depiction of them is accurate, then they aren't entitled to a land, and they most certainly aren't entitled to Israel. the Torah and prophets presents them as invaders from Crete that were essentially terrorists. The fact is, they had no independent language. They had no writing system. There isn't a single building that they constructed that has survived. They had no coinage. They had nothing going for them. They were simply a bunch of misfits that migrated out of Crete because they couldn't get along there into what is Israel, and they camped out in Gaza. And they really never expanded beyond Gaza. And because they were so belligerent towards the Jews in Israel, they were essentially decimated by them. After harassing them for years, it was Dode David, the prior king of Israel, who took it to them. He began by taking down their mightiest warrior, Goliath, with a single stone. He called him a foul-mouthed, uncircumcised Philistine. And then after having done that, what was learned is that the Philistines in Gaza were so savage that there was no reason for any outside force to conquer them and to enslave them. That was the nature of economies from, well, we know in Egypt, they enslaved the Jews, but it was also true of the Babylonians. They did the same thing. So did the Assyrians. But what happened with the Philistines is that they were so brutal, so monstrous, so violent that they made lousy slaves. Kind of funny today because Islam means slave to Allah. And so rather than doing the normal thing, which is going into a civilization, if they want to call them that, a community, and enslaving them for economic gain, when the Assyrians came into Gaza, they simply killed the Gazans. When the Greeks came into Gaza, they did the same thing. They simply killed them. The Egyptians did the same thing. And so by the time that the Greeks had come through under Alexander, that was the last of them. He cleaned up a small remnant of them. There hasn't been a Philistine for 2,300 years. So if you want to market yourself under a truthful name, Philistine, Palestinian is not it. They don't exist. There is no place called Palestine. There never was a place called Palestine. So again, if you want to use the legal system to enforce your political views, stop lying. There are no Palestinians, and there is no state of Palestine. As for Gaza, that is the place where the Philistines once lived. They left no legacy. There is no descendant from them. They were annihilated because they were savages. Well, this lawsuit is allegedly because these fake Estinians are saying that, and progressives, that by voting to send money to Israel, that they are exacerbating a horrible situation. They don't want to talk about the fact, and they're not bothered at all, that Gazan Muslims invaded Israel on 10/7/23. And unprovoked, Israel was not occupying Gaza, unprovoked, they tortured little children. They gang raped women and then mutilated their bodies. They abducted hundreds. They killed over 1,000. Most of the savagery was so horrific that it took months to even identify the victims. It was the most savage, monstrous attack by people pretending to be human in a very, very long time. They are not at all troubled that that occurred. They're not all troubled that the United States funds the United Nations, which funded all of this, which made all this possible. The money the United States sent to the United Nations that went into Gaza, indoctrinating that population, equipping the population, protecting that population so they could perpetrate this horrible crime, was not at all a bother to these progressives in California. It was not part of their lawsuit. It wasn't something they even mentioned. They didn't even want to mention that Israel is in Gaza because they're trying to defend their right to exist. They're trying to preclude 10/7 from occurring again. They allege that the support that is offered to Israel is unconscionable, and it is causing them weeping, inability to sleep, and distractions from work. The lawsuit filed in San Francisco federal court claims that the lawmakers, these Democrats, caused moral and emotional psychic injury to the taxpayers by voting for aid that the plaintiffs allege contributes to genocide in Gaza. This is so sick. And it's the reason I want to present this story to you again. To be so out of touch with reality that you would call a nation defending itself from what occurred on 10/7 of last year in Israel, which was savage, monstrous, brutal, terrorism at its absolute worst. And you want to call the nation holding those who perpetrated this accountable the cause of emotional and psychic injury. It indicates that you've lost all pretense of morality, that you're an intellectual zombie. Now we're going to talk about genocide, because genocide is what the Turks did to the Armenians when they slaughtered over 1 million of them in cold blood. Genocide is what Europeans perpetrated against Jews, systematically murdering 6 million of them. However, this term genocide didn't even exist until 1944. It was coined by a Polish Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, in his books, Axis Rule and Occupied Europe. It describes what occurred during the Holocaust. It required acts to be committed with the intent to destroy the vast majority of an ethnicity. That is why it's called genocide, as in genes. Therefore, genocide cannot be perpetrated in Gaza because there is no homogeneous ethnicity in Gaza. Genocide is from genes, and the only thing that unites the Gazans is Islam and Islam's hatred of Jews. And as I have stated, and it is irrefutable historically, there is no such thing as a Palestinian ethnicity or even a Gazan ethnicity. The occupants of Gaza are Egyptians, they're Jordanians, they're Syrians, they're Lebanese, they're a host of other ethnicities. So the term cannot be applied in this case. It can't be applied to a nationality because Gaza is not a nation. It can't be applied to a religion because in this case, there are 2 billion Muslims, and the death count in Gaza, even if you were to believe Hamas's exaggerations, would be such an insignificant percentage of them as to not even worth mention. And you're dealing with 0.0004. And most of them had it coming. There are 2.2 million Muslim Jew haters in Gaza. Now, I say that not to be pejorative, but because that is what is required in the Quran. If you don't agree, if you think that what I'm saying is inappropriate, we'll read the Quran. Or, better yet, go to goddamnreligion.org and read the 5 volumes of Goddamn Religion. In fact, I happen to have volume 5 here. These 4 volumes, plus this one, the 5th, average 825 pages apiece. What they are based on entirely is putting the Quran in chronological order and setting it into the context of Muhammad's life using the 2 oldest historical and chronological scriptural sources in Islam, the Tariq and the Sirah. What it presents is therefore irrefutable. If what it claims, based upon the older sources, and those older sources are the basis of Islam, that being the case, it cannot be refuted without refuting Islam, because it would have no basis without them. And if the basis of Islam is not true, then why are there 2 billion Muslims? Anyway, there 2.2 of these Muslim Jew haters are in Gaza. The Quran orders them to hate and kill Jews. Most of them either contributed to or celebrated 10/7. And the Hamas Health Agency, which is an oxymoron, is protesting that 45,000 innocent civilians have been killed. And the progressive media, of course, believes them and is reporting that and won't even put it into the context of this is a response to what those Muslims from Gaza perpetrated against Jews. Now, the fact is that Hamas is actually responsible for 100% of the deaths in Gaza. Not a percentage of them, 100% of them. And that is because they perpetrated 10/7, and then after murdering Jews, kidnapping Jews, torturing Jews, they retreated to Gaza to use women and children as shields. That is repulsive. And as a progressive, if you don't recognize that that's repulsive, that that's morally reprehensible, there's something seriously broken in your conscience. They also used hospitals, schools, and mosques. Not some of them, not on occasion, not part of them, all of them, as the headquarters and repositories for their weapons to kill Jews. And Israel, on the other hand, rather than bombing Gaza into oblivion, which it could have done and probably should have done, as the Americans did with German and Japanese cities throughout World War II, they instead have put at risk and sacrificed the lives of their own by sending Jewish men and women in to clean up the mess that Muslims have made. They have even sent out texts and pamphlets notifying the Muslims there where they were going to attack, when they were going to attack, so that when it happened, they would be out of harm's way. Never in the history of a people defending themselves has any country gone to such great lengths to minimize what is called civilian casualties. And never have perpetrators of such a heinous crime ever put their own at risk as these Islamic terrorists have done in Gaza. Now, Hamas has exaggerated the deaths to Israel's attacks, Israel's counter attack, actually, in Gaza, where they're literally trying to rid themselves of these very terrorists who seek to obliterate them, to exterminate them. And we'll begin by saying of that 45,000 that they alleged, 20% of the notices that they have accompanied those numbers with are so incomplete, there is actually no proof that the person lived, died, or was buried, nor even a cause of death. 80% of the numbers have some substance to them. 20% have none. or very little, not enough to qualify as evidence that someone lived and died, or more importantly, that they died as a result of the Israeli attempt to clean up Gaza. So 45,000 less this 20% brings us to 36,000 lives that are no longer with us in Gaza. Now, that number, however, and it is obvious that it's true, and it should be obvious to every progressive media outlet in the world that what I'm going to tell you next is true. No one bothers to do the math or mentions it. The fact is that Hamas is including non-combat deaths in the total. That means normal mortality. Now, with the mortality rate in Gaza at 4 per 1,000, recorded annually in 2022 and 2023, over the course of the 14 months since 10/7/23, that would be 10,000 normal deaths, just as part of life, in a 2.2 million population over that time. So that brings the 36,000 actual deaths down to 26,000 that could possibly be attributed to the Israeli defensive actions in Gaza. Israel, however, has terminated 20,000 of Hamas's and Islamic Jihad's 60,000 militants. Now, they all deserve to die. They would continue to fight and kill Jews. I don't know if you can call it fighting when you rape women and you abduct little children and you commit acts of such heinous conditions against an armed civilian population. But nonetheless, Israel has eliminated 20,000 terrorists, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, over these 14 months. They all deserve to die. And therefore, the maximum civilian casualties, if you take 26,000, you subtract 20,000, is 6,000. And even of that 6,000, most of them encouraged 10/7. They are not innocent. They celebrated 10/7. Look at the videos. They indoctrinated and protected those who perpetrated 10/7. Watch the videos on Muslims in Gaza celebrating the martyrdom of their sons and daughters. They encouraged it. They celebrated. In fact, Palestinian Authority even has a well-known plan called Slay for Pay. And so 6,000 potential civilian casualties amongst a population of 2.2 million is 0.002727, or 0.3% of the Gazan population. 0.3%. When you think of genocide, and you're going to use the term appropriately, you're talking about wiping out the majority of an ethnicity. No ethnicity here, and 0.3% isn't even the majority of 1%. It is exceedingly sad that we have people who garner national attention, who protest, who have access to the nation's microphones, and who scurry around within the United Nations, that will do such horrible things and make such egregious claims. In December of 1948, there was an article that was adopted on genocide by the United Nations, which again is filled with extreme liberals of questionable morality. This article came into effect in 1951. What it did, in essence, is completely redefine genocide so that the act that was perpetrated against Jews could be used against them. Now, if you don't think that's true, then all you need to do is realize that 2/3 of the sanctions by the United Nations against a country or against Israel, there are twice as many sanctions against Israel than there are the rest of the world combined. And Israel is probably the most moral nation on earth. Anyway, this was passed. And what they essentially did is that they redefined genocide. They said, genocide now is if you do something that causes harm to the majority or even a part of a community defined broadly as a religious community, a ethnic community, a national community, or any other group so defined. Group is ambiguous. It could be a group of chimney sweeps. And because all you have to do is cause any one of these things to part of them, that means if you were to send pigeons to poop on roofs so that a chimney sweep was injured, you would be guilty of committing genocide. That's how ludicrous this has become. So causing serious bodily injury or mental harm to members of the group. Oh, I guess now because it's members plural, you'd have to send pigeons to 2 different roofs and potentially cause mental harm to 2 chimney sweeps to be guilty of genocide. So let's be accurate. Deliberately inflicting group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Well, 0.3% is part of 1%, and 1% is part of 100%. So that must be in part, right? It doesn't even have a caveat for they deserved it. In other words, if chimney sweeps went on a killing spree and went down chimneys like Santa Claus and started killing little children and raping women, and the pigeon attack was sent to preclude them from being able to do that again, putting screens on the chimneys so they couldn't come down to do it, causing them mental harm because they couldn't get their jollies by raping and torturing children. Well, that would be genocide. Even though you were preventing grave harm to your own nation and ethnicity. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Excuse me? Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So, if the UN is indoctrinating all of the children of Gaza to not only hate Jews and to think that the highest calling in their life is to murder Jews, and they teach them how to use the weapons to kill Jews, removing the children from such indoctrination would be genocide. Indoctrinating to kill Jews, not so much. The convention also imposes the general duty on states that are signatories to prevent and to punish genocide. But if you're punishing genocide and you're attacking a group saying that they don't have the right to exist, aren't you committing genocide? Wouldn't you have to self-flagellate? This particular lawsuit is the latest as an example of how debates over Israel and Gaza have moved to the courts. This isn't a debate. This is stupid. This is using terms completely inappropriately. Palestinian, no such thing. Colonialization as it relates to Israel, no such thing. Palestine, no such thing. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Not only is there no Palestine, no Islamic country is free. Islam means submission. All Muslims are slaves to Allah. They're told explicitly they have no choice in any decision regarding their governance. Well, Previously, the courts dismissed the pro-progressive / pro-Palestinian groups' lawsuits that were filed in the area because they said that the courts cannot be used to change and intervene in government foreign policy. Seems pretty reasonable. However, this time they haven't thrown it out. It is, to me, one of these great injustices in the world today. And you see these anti-Semitic parades and marches on college campuses and through the streets of America. Like there's places now where Michigan looks like it's Gaza. Well, the Bay Area case seeks to bar Thompson and Huffman from doing their jobs, from being moral, from being rational, from approving future military aid to Israel so that Muslims can murder them indiscriminately. And it demands damages for the emotional distress caused by the war, including uncontrollable weeping, inability to sleep, and distractions from work, despair for the future of their children and for humanity. That is how disturbed, how out of touch with reality progressives are. It's almost as if these progressives want their share of the virgins in paradise so that they can be assumed as martyrs for their uncontrollable weeping. At a press conference outside the courthouse where the lawsuit was filed, Linda Helland, a Mendocino County resident and plaintiff, said that the representatives' votes make her and other constituents complicit in the violence. That means that you must be also complicit in the violence perpetrated by the Muslims now that you are trying to coddle and to protect, who committed an attempted genocide against the Jews in Israel. Another plaintiff, Tariq Kanana of Sonoma County, said that Thompson's actions amounted to adding in the killing of my own people. How can they be your own people when you don't even know what the ethnicity is of Gazans and they don't share an ethnicity? Do you ever think that maybe you ought to use words accurately? We're not asking the court to tell Congress to make policy, Attorney Dean Rover told the Chronicle. We're asking that the court to say that taxpayer dollars cannot be used to fund genocide. Great. No genocide taking place in Gaza, and never has been and never will be. So why not just drop the case? Why not admit that you're wrong? Well, this is, as I say, one of the greatest burdens that I have today, is the repositioning of Israel as evil when they are the most moral nation in the Middle East, amongst the most moral nations on earth. And it is being used to slander and denigrate Jews worldwide. It is the kind of rhetoric, imbecilic, immoral, grossly inaccurate, demeaning and demonic rhetoric that led to the Holocaust in the 1920s and 30s and 40s in Europe. We're seeing a rebirth of it, but this time it's not just among a single group of people. It's not just concentrated upon Europeans. It's not just Roman Catholics and Nazis that share this sentiment, because progressives and Muslims collectively total 3 billion people, and they live around the world. And they have united in their zeal to destroy, to denigrate, to demonize Jews and Israel. Well, I thank you for listening. This has been the YAHOWAH blog, a special news edition this Sunday, December 29th, 2024.